Hi guys, sorry to interrupt your viewing, but please subscribe to the channel and like this video. Thank you.
I knew something was off the moment I turned the key and stepped through the front door. You know how you can just feel it in your bones, like the air in the room has shifted slightly, heavier somehow, before you even see anything? That was exactly how it felt. My apartment, usually quiet and untouched when I come home, had a strange tension in it, like someone had been rearranging the air with their presence. And there she was, my Aunt Carol, sitting on my couch with her legs crossed, sipping tea from one of my favorite mugs like she belonged there, like this was her living room and not mine. She didn't even look startled or sheepish. In fact, she looked downright comfortable, like a woman who had already unpacked the first layer of her plan. Her suitcase was parked by the wall, zipped halfway open, and a cardigan I hadn't seen in years was draped over the back of one of my dining chairs like a flag claiming territory. I stood there in the doorway for a moment, trying to process what I was seeing, and she greeted me like nothing was out of the ordinary. "Hey, sweetie," she said, smiling like this was a casual Sunday brunch instead of a full-blown ambush. "I hope you don't mind, I let myself in. I just needed a place to crash for a little while." I didn't answer at first because honestly, I didn't know how. I blinked once, then twice, trying to find the right words that wouldn't come out sounding either too rude or too naive. "You needed a place?" I finally said, my voice trailing off in confusion. She waved her hand like she was brushing away a fly and gave a small chuckle, like I was being overly dramatic for not immediately hugging her in welcome. "It's just temporary," she said, as if that made it all fine. "A few weeks at most. I'm in between apartments right now, and you've got this whole place to yourself. It just makes sense. Plus, family helps family." I stood there in silence, trying to catch up to the casual entitlement in her tone. It wasn't just that she'd assumed it would be okay, it was that she hadn't even considered asking. There was no request in her voice, no acknowledgement that this was my home, my space, my sanctuary from the world. It was a declaration, wrapped in sugar and manipulation, and I could feel the heat rising in my chest before I even opened my mouth again. "I wish you'd talk to me first," I said carefully, trying not to sound angry even though I was already fighting the urge to snap. "This isn't really something you can just decide on your own." Her expression changed ever so slightly, not an apology, not a hint of embarrassment, but a flicker of something sharper beneath the surface. "Oh, come on," she said, her smile stretching thinner. "You've always been generous. Don't tell me you're going to turn your back on your own aunt over a little space and rent money. I thought you were better than that." And there it was, straight from the manipulator's playbook. The guilt trip wrapped in fake affection. The backhanded compliment soaked in obligation. The implication that I was suddenly selfish, ungrateful, heartless even, for not bending over backward to accommodate someone who had already made herself at home before I'd had a chance to blink. She started reminding me, as they always do, of all the things she had supposedly done for me over the years, babysitting once or twice when I was 10, sending me a birthday card with $20 a few times, giving me advice I never asked for but was always expected to be thankful for anyway. Have you ever been called selfish just because you said no? Not out of cruelty, but because you were finally drawing a line in the sand between your peace and someone else's entitlement? Have you ever been guilt-tripped for simply wanting space that belongs to you, for choosing your own sanity over someone else's chaos? Because in that moment, standing there in my own apartment while my aunt tried to paint me as the villain in a story she hadn't even asked me to be part of, I started to feel something I hadn't let myself feel in years, anger not just at her, but at myself for always giving in. I didn't yell. I didn't argue. I simply said, "I need some time to think," and walked out before the heat in my throat turned into a full eruption. I left her there on the couch, sipping from my mug, already scrolling through her phone like she had no doubt she'd won. And maybe, in that moment, she had. Maybe she thought I'd cave the way I always had before, smooth things over, swallow the discomfort, sacrifice my comfort to keep someone else's world spinning. But before I closed the door behind me, I saw her glance up and give me a little wave, like she already knew how the story would end. And just before I turned the corner, she called out with a smirk, Don't worry, honey. I know you'll come around. I think what people don't understand about being the so-called easy one is that it's not actually a virtue, it's a role, and often a prison disguised as praise. You spend your whole life hearing how mature you are, how calm you are, how lucky everyone is to have you around because you don't make things harder, but what they really mean is that you've learned how to suppress your own needs just to avoid setting off someone else's fuse. I learned that early, far too early, and by the time I was old enough to see the pattern clearly, it was already tangled deep in my skin like roots I couldn't pull out without bleeding. Even as a kid, I remember the way my family divided roles like casting parts in a play, except nobody asked me if I wanted mine. I just got handed the script and was expected to smile through it. My cousins could throw tantrums, demand things, push boundaries, and somehow they'd still get applause for being spirited or strong-willed, while I was praised for being understanding, patient, and agreeable. And Aunt Carol? She figured out very early on that I was the one who'd rather keep the peace than create a scene, and she never wasted a second taking advantage of that. I can still remember one Christmas when I was maybe 10 or 11. Aunt Carol showed up late, as usual, arms full of flashy gifts for everyone, loud stories spilling out of her like confetti, her voice drowning out whatever anyone else was trying to say. I had spent weeks picking out a thoughtful handmade gift for her, something I'd poured my little heart into, a picture frame I painted myself with a photo of us from a trip to the lake, one of the few times she'd actually paid attention to me. I wrapped it carefully, even added a bow, and handed it to her with shaking hands, hoping for a moment of acknowledgement. She opened it halfway, barely glanced at it, and then set it aside without a word, launching right back into another dramatic story about how her neighbor's boyfriend had keyed her car over some imagined insult. The room was laughing, gasping, captivated by her antics, while I just sat there, my cheeks burning, wondering how I'd let myself hope she'd even notice me. That was always the story with her: chaos as currency, attention as a performance, and guilt as her go-to currency when things didn't go her way. She had this way of making every situation about her, even when it had nothing to do with her. Family birthdays, graduations, even funerals somehow became platforms for her to monopolize the spotlight, and if anyone dared point it out, she'd shift into wounded martyr mode faster than you could blink. She'd clutch her chest, say things like, "I guess I'm just the black sheep," or "I'm sorry I'm such a burden," and suddenly everyone would be comforting her instead of confronting her. Meanwhile, I was always expected to be the adult in the room, even when I was still a child. By the time I was in my 20s, the pattern had become so routine I could practically write the script myself. Carol would ask for a favor, usually with some last-minute urgency, and I'd hesitate for 1 second too long. That's when the guilt would start. She'd remind me of all the things she'd done for me, even though half of them were exaggerated or imagined. She'd tell me I was being ungrateful, that I was cold, that I wasn't the sweet girl she used to know. Then the pressure would come from others in the family, little comments dropped like crumbs at dinner tables. "She's going through a rough time. You know Carol's a lot, but she means well. You're so good with boundaries, maybe just this once?" And I'd cave. Every time. Not because I didn't know better, but because somewhere deep down I was still clinging to this ridiculous belief that keeping the peace would eventually earn me some kind of peace in return. But it never did. The more I gave, the more she took. And the more I stayed silent, the more invisible I became. My needs weren't just dismissed, they weren't even part of the conversation anymore. I became the buffer between everyone else's mess and the thin illusion of family unity. I was the one who smoothed things over, bit my tongue, swallowed my pride, and then got labeled selfish the one time I dared to draw a line. And now here I was again, standing at the edge of another boundary, this time with the keys to my own apartment in my hand, and that old pressure knotting up in my throat. I told myself I'd hold my ground this time. I repeated it like a mantra, trying to drive it deeper than the old wiring that still whispered, "Don't make a scene, don't rock the boat, don't be the problem." But I could already feel the weight of that curse settling on my shoulders again, the curse of being the peacemaker in a family that only values you when you're quiet. The curse of knowing exactly how this story usually ends. And the terrifying part was, I wasn't sure I could stop it from happening again. There's a certain kind of numbness that sets in when you've spent your whole life being underestimated by the same people you've bent over backwards to accommodate. It's not quite pain, and it's not quite anger. It's colder than either of those. It's the slow erosion of hope paired with the steady tightening of something inside you that once wanted so badly to be understood. That's the feeling I had in my chest when I decided to drive over to my aunt's house that afternoon, hoping we could talk like adults for once in our lives. I wasn't expecting an apology, not really. I knew better than that by now, but I thought maybe, just maybe, if I explained things calmly and directly, she might actually hear me. I parked outside her house, turned off the engine, and sat there for a minute rehearsing what I would say. I wasn't going to yell. I wasn't going to accuse her of anything. I was going to set my boundaries clearly and firmly, like every self-help book had told me to do, with the hope that it might actually shift something between us. But as I stepped out of the car and walked toward the front porch, I caught the sound of her voice drifting through the open front window, and that's when the whole illusion shattered. I paused on the first step, unsure whether to keep moving or wait for her to finish whatever conversation she was having. But then I heard my name, clear, casual, tossed out like a punchline at a dinner party, and I froze in place. Her voice was unmistakably cheerful, laced with amusement, and I knew that laugh too well. It was the one she used when she thought she was being clever, when she was showing off. I leaned just slightly closer to the window, not intentionally trying to eavesdrop at first, but unable to stop myself once the words started to sink in. "She'll cave," she said, and I could almost hear her smirk through the glass. She always does. You know how she is, soft, too damn polite for her own good. I've got her wrapped around my finger. She'll say no a few times, but she'll come around. She always does. I stood there, motionless, the breeze nudging a loose strand of hair across my face while her words repeated themselves over and over in my head like a chant. I don't remember what else she said after that. I'm sure it was more of the same. More jokes. More casual confidence in how easily she could manipulate me into giving up my space, my time, my peace. But I didn't need to hear another word. Those first few lines were more than enough to burn a hole through whatever fragile thread of civility I'd been clinging to. And it wasn't rage that filled me in that moment. It was something sharper, colder, more precise. Not a desire to argue or confront or prove her wrong with loud declarations. No, what I felt was a shift, a hard click inside me like the sound of a door finally locking. I didn't want to fight her. I wanted to outplay her. I wanted to be the calm storm she never saw coming. I wanted her to feel what it was like when the person you thought would always bend simply doesn't move. So I didn't storm in. I didn't knock on the door. I didn't interrupt her little show with her friends or throw her smugness back in her face. Instead, I stepped off the porch, walked quietly back to my car, and closed the door behind me without a sound. I didn't need to say a word. She'd said everything I needed to hear. As I sat behind the wheel, my fingers resting lightly on the steering wheel, I stared ahead for a moment and let that sentence echo in my head one more time. She'll cave. She always does. I let it settle in my bones, not as an insult, but as fuel. Because if that's what she believed, if that's what she had built her entire sense of power on, then she was about to learn the difference between being soft and being stupid. I turned the ignition and pulled away from her house, not with a heavy heart, but with a clarity I hadn't felt in years. I wasn't going to argue. I wasn't going to beg to be respected. I was going to show her exactly what happens when the one you underestimated the most decides not to play along anymore. And I smiled. Not because I was happy, but because for the first time, I wasn't afraid of disappointing anyone but myself, and I was done doing that. She thought she knew how this story ended. But she had no idea the plot had just changed. There's something almost liberating about pretending to go along with a plan you have no intention of allowing to succeed, especially when the other person is so busy basking in their own manipulative confidence that they don't even notice the ground shifting beneath them. I walked back into my apartment the next day wearing a smile so convincing it nearly fooled me, and the moment I saw Aunt Carol lounging on my couch with a half-empty cup of coffee and her phone in hand, I knew exactly how I'd start playing my part. She greeted me like we were roommates already, like it was a done deal, like she had conquered some final piece of territory and now all that was left was furnishing it to her taste. I figured I'd start measuring the living room, she said casually, waving a tape measure around as if it were a magic wand. I was thinking maybe my old recliner could go in that corner, and maybe a standing lamp over there. Just until I get settled. I smiled and nodded, like the good niece she thought I was, the one who always gave in, always found a way to justify someone else's poor behavior, always rationalized disrespect in the name of family harmony. But behind that smile, I was already 3 steps ahead, and every word she spoke only sharpened my plan further. That night, I emailed my building's property manager and explained that I had a guest staying with me temporarily and wanted to make sure I was in full compliance with the lease terms. I phrased everything in a way that sounded thoughtful and respectful, the way people do when they want to be seen as responsible tenants while quietly laying the foundation for something more calculated. I asked about guest occupancy limits, visitor timelines, subletting clauses, and formal guest registration processes. What I got back was a beautifully detailed list of regulations that I knew Aunt Carol hadn't bothered to ask about, rules that made it abundantly clear that no one could stay more than 14 days without triggering additional legal protocols, rules that required written notification, documented consent, and strict adherence to the lease's primary residency clause. While she measured wall space and browsed furniture online, I was drafting paperwork, outlining everything in black and white so there would be no confusion when it came time to pull the rug out from under her. I revised my lease terms through the building's portal, added a formal note about limiting guests, and even looped in the HOA for extra enforcement support. Every move I made left a trace, an email, a timestamp, a notification, so if this ever turned into a dispute, I'd have a paper trail long enough to choke any counterargument she might try to spin. And still, I smiled. I helped her rearrange a few throw pillows. I made dinner one night and let her ramble about her new, living situation. I even humored her when she talked about bringing over more boxes, acting like I was already adapting to the change. But every conversation became an opportunity for documentation. Every time she referred to herself as living here, I made a mental note of the exact phrasing and timing. I started keeping a quiet log of every instance, a running list of her verbal claims and actions, so that when I needed to present evidence of her overstepping, I'd have more than just a gut feeling to point to. Then came the final piece of the trap, a little document I put together one night over a glass of wine and a heavy sigh, called a temporary guest agreement. I framed it like a favor, something to protect her from any potential lease issues, something to make it official, so we could avoid confusion. I told her it was just a formality, that it would help me keep everything clean with the building. She barely glanced at the fine print before signing it, too smug and self-assured to question what I might be tucking between the lines. What she didn't see was the clause stating her stay would be capped at 14 days, with no extensions, no rent-free occupancy, and no rights to residency of any kind. She didn't see the line about termination of the arrangement at my sole discretion, effective immediately upon written notice. She didn't see the part that allowed me to report her presence as a lease violation if she attempted to stay beyond the terms. But I saw it all. And I watched her sign it with a flourish, handing it back to me with that same condescending little smirk she always wore when she thought she'd won before the game even started. I tucked the signed agreement into my folder, thanked her for being so understanding, and made a note in my phone of the exact date her 14 days would expire. She thought I was bending. She thought I was giving in. She thought this was the part where I caved, where I did what I always did, grit my teeth, swallow my pride, and let someone else write the ending for me. But this time, I wasn't playing her game. I was rewriting the rules. And I had just gotten her signature on the first page. The strange thing about power is how quiet it becomes once you realize you actually have it, not in a loud, explosive way, but in the silent shifts that happen when people start feeling consequences they didn't see coming. The first week passed like a rehearsal, with Aunt Carol floating around my apartment like she was already the queen of the castle, humming while she folded her laundry on my couch, leaving half-drunk coffee cups scattered around my kitchen. and making comments about how she might upgrade a few things around here once she really settles in. I nodded and smiled and even handed her the remote while secretly counting down the days in my head like I was preparing for a launch. Every movement of hers became a breadcrumb I was adding to my trail, each one another marker leading her right to the trap she didn't even know she'd walked into. By the second week, her confidence had become insufferable. She'd invited a friend over without asking, which was already a violation of the lease's guest policy, but I said nothing. I just noted it down, time-stamped it, added it to my quiet collection of documentation. She had no idea that the very guest agreement she signed so casually 2 weeks earlier had become the legal linchpin I was about to drive right into place. When the 14th day rolled around, I submitted everything: emails, a copy of the agreement, a formal letter of notification stating that her temporary stay had expired, and that she was now violating lease terms and would need to vacate immediately or face formal eviction proceedings. My building manager was professional but firm, and when they sent her the official notice, the shift in Aunt Carol's expression was like watching someone fall through a trapdoor they didn't know existed. She tried to brush it off at first, waving the paper in the air like it was some bureaucratic error that would sort itself out. "Oh, this is just nonsense," she said, laughing nervously. "They must have misunderstood. I'm family, it's not like I'm a tenant." But I saw it in her eyes, the first flicker of panic underneath all the bluster. She was starting to realize that this wasn't just another situation where she could manipulate her way through with a sob story and a glass of wine. And just in case the paperwork wasn't enough, I made sure to let her own words speak for themselves. I still had that little voice recording I'd captured by sheer accident, the one from her porch where she'd bragged to her friends about how I'd cave like I always did. I didn't blast it on social media or send it to the building staff, that would have been too obvious. No, I sent it to someone far more efficient at destroying reputations than any formal complaint ever could: my cousin Dana, the family gossip pipeline in human form. All I had to do was text her the audio file with a simple message that read, "Thought you might want to hear what Carol's been saying about me." By the end of the day, the clip had done its work. My phone started lighting up with messages from various relatives, some pretending to be shocked, others delighting in the drama, a few asking me if I was okay, all of them now suddenly seeing Aunt Carol in a different light. The woman who had always held court at family gatherings with exaggerated tales and dramatic sighs was now the subject of whispers and sideways glances. Her charm, that practiced mask she'd worn so effortlessly for years, was cracking, and beneath it, people were finally starting to see the manipulation she'd always kept hidden behind fake affection and performative generosity. She paced more those last couple of days. She made phone calls in hushed tones and shot me side glances like she couldn't figure out when the dynamic had shifted, when the niece she'd always viewed as soft and spineless had turned into the architect of her downfall. But still, I said nothing. I didn't gloat. I didn't throw her words back in her face. I simply waited, knowing the pressure would build until it had nowhere else to go but through the front door. And sure enough, it did. One evening, just after sunset, I heard it, the heavy pounding of her fist against my front door, not a polite knock but an angry, desperate rhythm that echoed through the apartment like a warning bell. I stood still for a moment, just listening to it, watching the way the shadows from the hallway light flickered across the walls. I didn't rush to answer. I didn't reach for the doorknob. Because that sound wasn't just frustration, it was fear. And it was the sound of someone finally realizing that the walls she thought she'd built around me were actually closing in on her instead. The pounding on the door didn't stop for several long moments, like she thought that if she just kept hammering hard enough, I'd crack open the world and let her walk back through it, the way I always had. But this time was different. This time, I wasn't pacing behind the door, nervously rehearsing how to de-escalate things, trying to find the softest words to wrap around my boundaries just to make them more palatable for someone who never respected them in the first place. I stood there in total stillness, breathing in through my nose and out through my mouth, not shaken, not rattled, just profoundly, unmistakably certain of what I needed to do. I opened the door just wide enough to see her face, but not enough to let her think she had even a toe back inside my space. She looked tired, more from pride than exhaustion, like someone who'd just realized the hand they were playing had been folded before they ever sat at the table. Her eyes flicked past my shoulder as if she expected to still see her things inside, maybe her bag by the couch or her coffee mug on the counter, little artifacts of assumed permanence she believed were hers to claim simply because I'd never said otherwise. She launched into it almost instantly, the same routine I'd heard 100 times before, like pressing play on a scratched-up cassette tape of manipulation dressed in emotional desperation. "I don't know what's gotten into you," she said, her voice tinged with the usual performative heartbreak that was more habit than sincerity. "You've always been the kind one, the generous one, the one I could count on. And now you're acting like some stranger." But I didn't flinch. I didn't shift my weight nervously or offer a single excuse. I didn't feel compelled to comfort her, to soften my truth, to absorb her discomfort just so she wouldn't have to feel it herself. I let her words hit the space between us and fall flat, and then I looked her in the eyes and said the only thing that needed to be said. "I'm not your fallback plan anymore." She blinked, caught off guard by the calm in my voice, probably expecting a breakdown or a lecture or at least a tear or two. But there was nothing in me left to give her. I had spent too many years patching over her chaos with pieces of my peace, too many years confusing patience with passivity and empathy with obligation. I wasn't angry anymore. I was simply done. "I've spent most of my life shrinking myself to make other people comfortable," I continued, "especially you. I let you take space I didn't offer. I let you write the script and cast me as the background character who always said yes, always nodded, always carried the weight you refused to admit was yours. But that's over now. I didn't wake up cruel. I just finally woke up clear." She tried again, a smaller voice this time, reaching for one last line of guilt. "So you're just going to shut me out like I'm nothing to you?" "No," I said, still quiet, still firm. "I'm shutting you out because I finally understand I was nothing to you, except convenient." I didn't wait for another response. I didn't slam the door in some dramatic flourish, because this wasn't about rage or revenge. I simply closed it. Slowly, deliberately, and then I turned the lock, not in defiance, not as a threat, but as a boundary made visible and unmovable. And then I walked away. I didn't cry afterward. I didn't feel triumphant either. What I felt was something deeper, something that didn't need validation or applause. I felt peace, not the fragile kind that comes from keeping everyone else happy, but the solid kind that comes from knowing you finally chose yourself and didn't apologize for it. She stood out there for a few more minutes, muttering to herself, maybe hoping I'd open the door again or offer some final olive branch she could twist into her own narrative. But I didn't move. I didn't answer. I let her stand in the silence she had earned and finally face the absence of the person she thought would always be there to clean up after her. They thought I was weak because I didn't fight. But maybe silence is the sharpest blade of all. Was it revenge? Maybe. Or maybe I just learned how to stop apologizing for my own boundaries.